Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something that constantly operates behind the scenes, but literally controls how power flows in a democracy. We're talking about the mathematical voting rules of a constitution. Let's just dive right into this. A truly great system of governance, it can't just operate at one speed. It has to hit this perfect balance, right? You need a flexible system that can handle everyday emergencies, but you also need a rigid system that protects the core rights of citizens from sudden, drastic changes. And the way a constitution actually achieves this balance, it's through a brilliantly designed ladder of voting majorities.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with an introduction to voting rules, move on to the everyday simple majority, step up to effective and absolute majorities, tackle the three special majorities, and then finally, we'll face the ultimate state ratification.
Section 1. Introduction to Voting Rules.
So a nation's rulebook is basically a giant balancing act. It's a synthesis of things that are pretty easy to change and things that are heavily, almost mathematically, protected. Think of a nation's legislative building for a second. The interior furniture. You can move that around super easily to fit the day's needs. That's your flexible legislation. But the load-bearing pillars, the actual foundation, you cannot just knock those down. To do that, you need special equipment, massive planning, and a way higher threshold of effort. In parliamentary terms, different actions require different mathematical weights, and that's what gives structure and stability to the whole shebang.
Section 2. The everyday simple majority.
All right, let's look at the absolute foundation of getting things done, the simple majority. In plain English, this rule only counts the people who actually showed up to work today. It completely ignores any absentees. So, say you have a room of 500 people, right? But only 100 show up, and only those 100 cast a vote. Well, you literally just need 51 people to agree to pass the rule. It's often called a functional or working majority, simply because it gets the job done.
Now, you might think this simple rule is just for the small stuff, but actually, no way. This is how the heavy, day-to-day business of a nation is handled. We're talking passing ordinary laws, approving the nation's entire budget, and get this, even admitting completely new states into the Union. It's also the threshold for a no-confidence motion, which means the very survival of the ruling government entirely depends on keeping a simple majority happy on any given day.
Moving on to Section 3. Effective and absolute majorities.
Okay, but think about this for a second. What happens when we need a bit more stability, and the math needs to get a little more rigid? Consider a real-world scenario. A legislative house is almost never perfectly full. People resign, sometimes, tragically, members pass away. That leads to permanent vacancies. So what do? Do we still judge the majority by the original blueprints of the House, or do we adjust the math for the empty chairs?
Enter the effective majority. This rule basically says, okay, we need more than 50% of the total seats, but we are strictly going to subtract the seats that are currently vacant. You're finding the real quote-unquote effective strength of the room before you ever do that having math. This is a specialized tool, mostly used for serious internal housekeeping, like if they need to remove a speaker or a deputy chairman from their position.
Let's put some real numbers to this to make it super concrete. Take the Lok Sabha, which is the lower house of India's parliament. The total number of seats there is exactly 543.
So let's see how this math plays out in reality. Imagine 15 of those 543 seats are completely empty because of resignations. Your new total, your effective strength, is now 528. Half of 528 is 264. Therefore, to get more than 50%, your effective majority becomes exactly 265. Boom. That is your magic number to remove a speaker in this very specific scenario.
Now, let's flip the script and look at an absolute majority. This one requires more than 50% of the total seats, regardless of who is absent or even if seats are completely vacant. It literally does not care if half the politicians stayed home sick. It is the immovable, hard-coded halfway point of the entire structural House size.
For that exact same 543-seat House we just talked about, the absolute majority is 272. Period. You will always need 272. Now, this immovable number isn't typically used all by itself to pass laws, but as we're about to see, it is an absolutely vital ingredient for the hardest votes on our ladder.
Just to make absolutely sure we've got this down, because it can be tricky. Absolute majority counts every single seat on the blueprint, completely ignoring reality. Effective majority adjusts to reality by subtracting those permanently vacant seats first before finding that halfway point. Keep this locked in your mind, because we are heading into the high-stakes rules right now.
Section 4. The three special majorities.
All right, so we're in the rigid part of the rules now. And here's a massive question for you.
How do you actually fire a president or remove a Supreme Court judge? You definitely cannot use an everyday simple majority for this. If a government could just remove a Supreme Court judge because, hey, a few opposition members were stuck in traffic one afternoon, the entire system of checks and balances would literally collapse. We need way harder voting rules.
That brings us to the special majority. This is a formidable, top-tier level of voting designed exclusively to protect the absolute core features of the system. It generally involves hitting a 2/3 threshold, which makes it exceptionally difficult to achieve unless you have really broad cross-party consensus.
Okay, let's break this down step by step, because there are actually 3 flavors here, and the mathematical difficulty scales perfectly with how severe the action is. Type 1 requires 2 things at the exact same time. First, you need that absolute majority we just talked about, more than 50% of the whole House. Plus, you need 2/3 of the people actually present and voting. It's a double lock. You use this bad boy for amending most of the Constitution and, yep, removing Supreme Court judges. Type 2. This is the absolute hardest single House rule. 2/3 of the total membership. It doesn't matter who's absent, you need 2/3 of the entire blueprint of the House to agree. This is reserved for the gravest action possible, impeaching the president. And then there's Type 3, which is a bit more situational. 2/3 of those present and voting. This one's specifically used in the upper house to allow the central parliament to step in and temporarily make laws on subjects that are usually reserved just for the states.
And finally, Section 5, the ultimate state ratification.
So here we are, the absolute highest rung on our escalation ladder. Some changes are just so massive, so deeply impactful to the entire architecture of the country that the central legislature simply cannot do it alone. They are straight up not allowed to unilaterally change the balance of power.
This is the ultimate, heavy-duty 2-step lock. First, you have to pass the law at the center using a Type 1 special majority, that double lock we just covered. Then, the bill actually leaves the Capitol. It travels out to every single state legislature in the country, and at least half of those states must approve it using a simple majority. And what's really wild here, there's literally no time limit set for the states to make their decision. They can take as long as they need.
So why go through all this headache? Well, because it protects the delicate balance of federalism. Just look at what actually requires this massive effort. Changing how the president is elected, altering the powers of the Supreme Court, changing how many seats the states get in parliament, or, and this is the big one, trying to alter the rules of the game itself. You literally cannot change the amendment procedure without the states agreeing to it.
And that literally brings us to the very top of our ladder. We've climbed all the way from the working level simple majority of everyday business up to the near impenetrable fortress of state ratification. So I want to leave you with this thought. If the most crucial rules, like the powers of the Supreme Court or the fundamental rights of the states, were even a little bit easier to change, would the entire foundation still hold its shape during times of massive political turmoil? This mathematical ladder of majorities, it isn't just boring bureaucratic red tape. It is the vital, invisible engineering that keeps a democracy stable. It basically guarantees that the bigger the change, the louder the consensus absolutely must be. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning how the rules shape your world.